All right, take a moment and think about what is the difference between liberal and conservative positions on the following issues: war, environment, and taxation. Liberals and conservatives have different opinions on these issues, and it's important that you understand the differences between them. So go ahead and brainstorm what you already know about their positions on these things. Today we're going to talk about Democrats, Carter, oil, and war, and I'd like you to keep in mind those differences. Democrats tend to be more in favor of negotiations and embargoes, or at least that's the way they present to their people, or the people that typically vote Democrat. Republicans tend to be more patriotic, more traditional in their values, and favor having a strong American presentation to the world outside. On the environment, Democrats tend to be more in favor of protecting and conserving the environment. And so you can begin to see some of the tensions there between these different groups. And so when we're talking about President Carter in the 1970s, we have a major environmental crisis going on, as well as a crisis of oil and the beginnings of wars in the Middle East. The 1970s is the end of an economic era. Employment and wages are stagnated, meaning there aren't a lot of job opportunities for people. Wages aren't going up, and so people are not they're not making more money from year to year. And at the same time, prices and interest rates are going up. So you have inflation as well as stagnation. Prices of goods and services, prices of oil, prices of food, typical grocery store runs and things that you need in your daily life. Prices of electricity and other things that you need are going up, whereas people's wages are not going anywhere. Vietnam War spending and no new taxes plunges us deeper into debt. So there's no way to pay for a war like that, especially one that goes on as long as Vietnam did, without raising taxes. And we didn't do that. And so the nation in and of itself is going into debt. Interest rates are hitting 21%, which is extremely high. A typical college loan, for example, is around 5%. Car loans are usually between 0 and 2%, so super low. So interest rates are hitting up as high as 21%, which is ridiculous. Inflation hit 18% by 1980, which is pretty rapid inflation. And average wages dropped by 14%. So you have the prices of everything in your life going up, but your wages are going down, and those two things don't add up. Poverty hits 15%, so 15% of the American public was living in poverty, and it has continued to actually go up since then. You can see in the picture our economy is really struggling. We're in transition. Basically, we're not really an industrial country anymore. So many labor laws have been passed in our country that it makes it really difficult to manufacture things here. And so manufacturing has been throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and up till today has been being shipped overseas, typically into Asia and Southeast Asia, where labor laws aren't as strict. And so now we need to make a transition to what type of economy we are going to have in our country. So this whole concept is called stagflation. It refers to the unusual economic situation in which an economy is suffering both from inflation and from stagnation of its industrial growth. In 1978, Proposition 13, known as the People's Initiative to Limit Property Taxation, passed in response to high property taxes in California. Americans were sick of tax and spend liberals, or rather Carter, who was president at the time. And this is really interesting because part of the reason our government's economy is struggling so much is because we aren't taxing. And so when the government tries to do that by instituting a property tax in California, the people revolt. And so people want to limit property taxation, but with that comes cutting a lot of public sector jobs. And so you can see some of the protests that ensued in this picture. At the same time, overseas, we have some major issues going on. In 1953, the United States overthrew the Shah of Iran. The Shah was trying to establish a democracy in Iran, but at the same time was nationalizing Iran's oil industry to regulate the output, possibly for environmental concerns, but also to regulate how much of its oil was probably going to countries like the United States and otherwise. And this would certainly limit the amount of oil that we had access to, and we, in general, weren't a big fan of the Shah. And so the United States, with our CIA, staged a military overthrow, and we overthrew the dictator of Iran and put into someone, we overthrew the Shah, who was a democratic leader of Iran, and instead we put into place a dictator that was favorable to us. Obviously, this didn't go over very well with the Iranian people, who were pretty happy with the democracy that was being established there. And so this led to something called the Iran hostage crisis. In 1979, Iranians, typically college students, young Iranians, overthrew the puppet dictator, who we actually snuck out of Iran on a plane and gave him protections in the United States, gave him a safety net there. But they took all Americans, save a couple that escaped to a Canadian embassy, in the U.S. embassy hostage. And here in the picture, you can see people climbing over the gate and getting into the American embassy. Americans were released after 444 days of negotiations. The negotiations basically being send us back the dictator and so that we can deal with him appropriately. And when you do that, we will release these hostages. And the United States was adamant and refused to send back the dictator. But every single one of those 444 days negotiations were happening. The United States backed Iraq in its invasion of Iran. Iraq is typically a Sunni Muslim country, whereas Iran is strongly Shiite, and these two religious groups are in opposition, and both have pretty strong leaders. Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and Iran. Needless to say, the Iranian people were not happy with our actions in overthrowing their Shah, and so this leads to the Iran hostage crisis. In 1979, Iranian college students overthrow the puppet dictator, who the United States flew out in time to save him, and took all Americans in the U.S. embassy hostage. You can see in the picture here the young Iranians climbing over the gates and getting into the American embassy, which is supposed to be protected sort of sanctuary in the United States, or it should be as if that territory behind that gate is U.S. territory. Ultimately, Americans were released after 444 days of negotiations, where the Iranians basically said, send us back the Shah, the dictator, and we will release the hostages. The other reason that these negotiations ended is because Iraq invaded Iran, forcing them to sort of shift focus from the hostage situation to dealing with a war. The United States was backing Iraq in its war with Iran. Interestingly, in 1987, there was something called the IranContra Scandal, and so despite the fact that Iran was our bigger enemy in the region, it's also the most powerful in the region and one that we would really like to have on our side. And in 1987, the United States gave weapons to Iran on a different issue, and those weapons were tracked to fund terrorism in South America. And this is known as the IranContra Scandal. The United States was basically caught under President Reagan giving weapons to Iran that we knew were ultimately going to go to fund Contra terrorists down in Nicaragua. Here are some pictures of the Iranian hostage crisis. Here they are burning an American flag. This is a picture of the Americans blindfolded and being held hostage for 444 days. They were often held in pretty awful circumstances, not really knowing whether or not they were going to live or die while they were there. Back in the United States, you can see the origins of some extreme nationalism happening in our country. This young man says to deport all Iranians, get the hell out of my country. This sort of attitude, an anti-Muslim, anti-Middle Eastern attitude, is not new to our country. At the same time in Israel, Israel was established as a Jewish country after World War II. Its neighbors, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, all Islamic countries, did not like the way that the Israelis were treating Palestinians who had been forcibly removed. It's important to note that the land of Israel is land that is traditionally claimed by all of the major Western world religions. However, the conflict in Israel largely has to do with land and access to water resources and less to do with religion. Israel fought several wars and skirmishes to establish its right to exist. One of those I'll tell you about briefly, but essentially there's a series of these wars that lead to Israel getting more land and then ultimately giving it back to its Arab, Muslim neighboring countries in an attempt to try to say, we have a right to be here, we own this land, please let us have this land and let us have a right to be here. Terrorism in Israel is still a pretty prevalent issue today, and Israel is our greatest ally in the region. The Arab-Israeli War of 1973, also known as the Yom Kippur War, this is when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel, and the United States provided aid to Israel that helped turn the tide of the war. The Soviet Union supported the Arab states, and so while you can see this might be the origins of a new issue for us, this is still the continuation of a lot of Cold War policies. We are going to secretly be going against the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union supporting the people that we are not supporting. A lot of this comes to a head and then change begins to happen with the oil embargo. Oil producing and exporting countries, also known as OPEC, refused to sell oil to the United States due to its policies in the Middle East. Some of these policies being the way that we treated the Iranians and also our stance and constant support of Israel. Some of these countries include Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Syria, Jordan, etc. The oil embargo, which is a sanction or a refusal to trade oil with the United States, led to an economic disaster. There were gas lines and riots, and we basically had a major energy crisis in the United States. This highlighted or illustrated our short-sighted policy based on non-renewable energy controlled by foreign countries, and it led many people who opposed war and other alternatives for getting control of the oil to demand that we begin searching for renewable energy options and investing in renewable energy and reducing our dependence on foreign oil. Here are some pictures of the gas lines in the 1970s. Here they are coming up with a coded system to let people know whether or not they have gas. President Carter, who is president at this time, is a Democrat. He is an outsider. He's religious. He went to the Naval Academy. He was an engineer and a veteran. He was also from the South, which had a lot of appeal with many Republicans in the South. He was economically conservative, but supported human rights to replace the mindless anti-communism sort of brainwashing that was going on in our country during the Cold War. He also wanted to assist Latin American countries to become more independent and stronger. And so many people got behind him in regards to that. He had been the governor of Georgia and wasn't really corrupted by Washington. And so many people thought that he might be able to sort of fix some of the Nixon era problems that we were having. Other major things begin to change. There's a huge environmentalist movement that comes out of this time. In 1979, there was a major mechanical failure at 3 Mile Island. This was caused by human error in Pennsylvania, and it permitted an escape of radiation of over a 16-mile radius, which was a major problem. At the same time, there was a book that was written called Silent Spring by a woman named Rachel Carson, and she writes this book to give a voice and to voice the concerns that environmentalists had at the time, not just about this, but of our overconsumption and our lack of investment in renewable energy and kind of the way that we were treating the earth at the time. This essentially launched the environmentalist movement by pointing out the effects of civilization and development and industrialization and a lot of the problems that we are so aware of today. Environmentalism was something that Jimmy Carter essentially championed. Like Teddy Roosevelt, he attacked the oil crisis and tried to reduce our dependency on foreign oil. He increased what we were doing with conservation, something that Teddy Roosevelt championed. He created the Department of Energy, something that we know very well today, to research and invest and advise him on energy crises, conservation, and environmental issues. He also created the EPA, which is the Environmental Protective Agency, which is an independent federal agency established to coordinate programs aimed at reducing pollution and protect the environment. The EPA also gives out recommendations for emissions in cars, recommendations about different programs, different energy sources, and different ways that we can protect the environment. Jimmy Carter is famous, though, for his malaise speech. This is an interesting speech. He delivers it in response to the energy crisis, and many people don't react well to his speech. It was most notable for his bleak assessment of the national condition and his claim that there was a crisis of confidence that had struck at the very heart and soul of our national will, and kind of basically blamed the American people for the energy crisis and for a lot of the problems that we were having in our country. Basically, we don't want it enough, we're not working hard enough, and it's the American people's problem. This speech helped to fuel charges that the president was trying to blame his own problems on the American people and that he wasn't a strong enough leader as commander-in-chief. And so Jimmy Carter is not reelected, maybe not just because of this speech, but because of sort of the lack of success of a lot of his programs that he tried. Conservative reaction grows. In 1976, the Hyde Amendment limited Medicaid funds for abortion, basically saying that the government isn't going to pay for your abortions, but you are welcome, but not saying that you can't have one. In 1978, regents of the University of California, the Bake upheld affirmative action but rid of quotas. And so in this particular Supreme Court case, what they were saying was you can they basically said you cannot create quotas because that is creating discrimination against white people. It's essentially saying you can't have, say, 16% of your incoming students be black. You can't just put a blanket on that. The students that you take in as a college need to be qualified to be there. So you can't have quotas, but you can have affirmative action be a factor in your decision. So if you have two equally qualified candidates, one white and one is black, then you are welcome to take the black student in because it's a factor that might influence your decision. And same thing with women and otherwise. Southern Democrats pretty much become Republicans and begin to blame the poor for their problems and for the national problems. And this is a major shift. We now see Southern Democrats transitioning and becoming Republicans. And so we have a large part of our country being Republicans. Christians push the return to family values, and we see the rise of the moral majority, which helped to mobilize Christian voters throughout the 1980s.